Before we dive into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.
You're stuck in the same spot forever. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 43, from Columbus, Ohio, and those words landed in the fluorescent light of the conference room like a verdict because they came from Martin Holly and because the room was full of people who had watched me fold my life into unpaid overtime for 15 years. The meeting had been billed as a routine quarterly update, but the way Martin smiled across the table, the way Blake Turner kept his hands folded like a man who'd been promised something he hadn't actually earned, told me this was a performance, and I was the prop. Angela Ruiz snorted. Tyler Bennett checked his phone like a man waiting for a punchline he already knew. Sandra Kim from HR looked at her hands as if she could sign away the memory by smoothing the paper between her fingers. I felt my wife's thumb on the inside of my palm in my pocket, a reflex we developed over years of dinners canceled and birthdays rescheduled, and even the quiet cough from my daughter in the back seat after school, waiting in the car with the window cracked, felt like a witness. They had my resume pinned to their expectations for so long that when I stopped moving, everyone felt a need to poke. I'd been the man who fixed the outages at 2 a.m, the man who flew on a Tuesday when clients insisted, the man who stayed when others left. I'd been the whiteboard after every bad quarter, the slow voice who explained numbers until people stopped asking questions and started nodding. When Martin presented Blake as the new director, he read the announcement with practiced warmth and a hand on my shoulder that felt for all the world like the prelude to a dismissal notice. "Fresh eyes," he said. "Someone with energy." Energy was the word they used where they used to say competence. Blake's laugh was quick and self-satisfied. He'd been with us 3 years and had perfected saying yes to everything that moved. I could feel the old muscle of anger flex in me, the one that had taught me to bite and not to bite back in the small moments that clustered into the big ones. I could have stood up. I could have told them about the nights I'd worn the same shirt to 2 client dinners because the washer had broken and the baby's daycare account was behind another month. I could have told them about the college fund delayed by a mortgage payment shifted from should to must because someone upstairs thought dedication looked good in an annual report. Instead, I made a decision that surprised even me. I folded my hands, closed my mouth, and I quit quietly the next day. The humiliation hung in the air like confetti stuck to my shoes, and the laughter that followed Martin's line kept ricocheting off the cubicles for weeks. Whispered jokes behind my back, a sarcastic, "Nice of you to come in, Ethan," when I passed the break room. The way Tyler would say "stuck in the same spot," with that exact cadence that made a clean cut into whatever pride I'd kept tucked away. Everyone assumed I'd explode, that I'd sue, that I'd lean into a primal, violent righteousness, because that was the Hollywood ending they'd been waiting to watch. They wanted spectacle, and I gave them silence instead. Quiet is a strange weapon. It makes people impatient, and that impatience often reveals itself in sloppy leadership and decisions made to make noise rather than make sense. Quitting was not a surrender. Quitting was the moment I decided I wouldn't let them tether my life to the idea of loyalty that was actually exploitation. I walked out with a cardboard box and with my wife's quiet clapping in the hallway, because she understood that I wasn't leaving for anger, but for a long game. I didn't want anyone else to write for me. For a while they exchanged pitying glances, and I liked the sound of that pity like a low-level thunder. It kept them busy. It kept them thinking they were in charge. I started small, taking freelance projects that paid for groceries and the occasional repair, walking into diners early to write proposals over coffee that had no sugar because sugar felt like a luxury. I hired one man to help me with the back end. Marcus Lyle, a former sysadmin who smelled faintly of oil and always had story about a thing that broke and how he fixed it. I found a woman to handle accounting, Denise Harper, who could make a spreadsheet sing and who laughed once when I said, "Startup," like she had been waiting for someone to stop apologizing for wanting better. We were scrappy in a way I hadn't known I could be. We were honest because we couldn't afford anything else. My wife, Laura, took extra shifts at the clinic for a while and learned to say no to PT obligations in a way that made her feel less guilty and more human. We ate cheaper sometimes and drove cars that had stories for their dents. The children learned the value of a weekend spent fixing a leaky gutter with their father rather than having him gone at a client dinner. And I watched them sharpen into people who remembered me being present. Those years were not glamorous. They were the slow, necessary accretion of competence. We built a tiny company that solved the problems Martin's firm had chosen to ignore. The things that looked small on quarterly reports but in human lives were huge. We made a piece of software that didn't promise the moon, but that did exactly what it claimed. It connected teams so they could actually talk, not just report. The product had flaws in the beginning, of course. There were nights we wanted to throw away a whole module and start over, and there were days when a client would call at noon and demand something for yesterday, and we would do it because our reputation was newly fragile and we had to earn breathing room. Marcus became a partner. Denise kept the books like a mercenary with a conscience, and the people who joined us did so because they wanted to fix things, not because someone in a dark office told them it was trendy. We moved into a converted warehouse that smelled of sawdust and ambition, and when we hired our first intern, I cried in the bathroom because it felt like a small, private vindication. We grew in the way things grow when they are nourished instead of trodden. Steady, sometimes awkward, but real. Word spread, not the kind of word that spreads when a firm buys its press, but the honest kind. A recommendation, a forwarded email, someone who had a problem and told a friend that we fixed it. We took on a small municipality that had a communications backlog so legendary their mayor had stopped answering press calls. We took that filthy, neglected set of legacy systems and rewired them, and the mayor's office sang our praises in an article that landed in a paper I used to read in the conference room as a reminder of where I had been. I sat in my office with the blinds down and read the piece, my coffee cooling on the desk, and I thought of Martin's laugh and of Blake's thin smile, and of the way people had watched a man who'd given them years of himself and then treated him like a placeholder. There is a bruised satisfaction in watching something you built hold up under pressure. There's a fiercer, quieter pleasure in knowing you built it on terms you chose. Years drifted, not in a melodramatic montage, but in a series of meetings and mistakes and corrections that each hardened us a little. We learned to fire people when they needed firing, to admit errors publicly, and then fix them faster than anyone expected, to take ownership when a client complained at midnight, and to show up the next morning for the face-to-face apology. We attracted talent who wanted to do more than check boxes. We attracted clients who had been burned by firms that cared about headlines. Meanwhile, Martin's company changed in ways I should have felt sympathy for, but didn't. He hired a string of yes men, men and women, who took profit as an ethical system and who believed that speed trumped judgment. The shareholders loved it at first because the numbers looked exciting, headline growth that smelled expensive and hollow. They outsourced the critical work to consultants who rebranded the same mistakes with fancier slides and cut the very teams that kept the lights on. Blake Turner was good at PR. He could smile and deflect with a compliment. He convinced people that boldness meant ignoring the messy daily things that actually saved companies from collapsing. The first public stumble was a botched product launch that had been rushed to market to beat a competitor. Their QA team, the one they'd shrunk to save a quarterly statement, missed a glaring security flaw. The press had a feast and the clients had lawyers. Martin staggered through apologies like a man trying to find his footing on someone else's rug. He called emergency meetings and hired a parade of consultants who left after billing the company in full and promising nothing. I watched from a distance as their stock dropped and morale followed, as competent people left in waves and were replaced by people who loved the idea of a job more than the work it required. We picked up the pieces in the marketplace piece by piece. Clients who needed actual help called us, not because they liked my face in a photo feature, but because our code didn't have holes, and our team answered calls at odd hours and didn't bill extra for basic decency. That was the irony. Our integrity became our competitive advantage. It is strange how quickly power unravels when your moral foundation is built on loudness instead of craft. Then the email came. It was from Sandra Kim, who'd been HR when I left, and had watched the initial meeting with the same internal conflict. I remembered. Her signature line included Martin's name and a subject that was nearly a physical thing: urgent consult. Her message was short enough that parsing it felt like reading a man in crisis who had not yet decided whether to beg or to blame. Martin asked me to reach out, she wrote. They're interested in bringing you in as a consultant to advise on crisis management. My first impulse was to delete it and savor whatever private, selfish joy felt like a candle in a cellar. Then another message arrived from a client we'd never imagined we'd have. The municipal contract we'd fixed had been watching the headlines. They forwarded an inquiry Martin had made, asking for a meeting to talk about options. It took me 36 hours to decide how to answer. I called Marcus because he knew how I thought in practical terms. I called Denise because she would measure risk with a blunt instrument. I called Laura because she would measure my soul the way the rest of us measured spreadsheets. Marcus said, "They're desperate," and laughed because desperation is the easiest word to monetize. Denise said, "There are fees involved. There's liability. Proceed cautiously." Laura said, "Go see what kind of apology looks right to give, not who looks right to save." I put the appointment on my calendar for a Thursday at noon because I wanted the humiliation to happen in daylight, because I wanted witnesses in my own life to be present if this was going to be a crossroads. I walked into Martin's office with the confidence of someone who had learned to carry his own light, not the faint blaze of a man still holding a candle against a storm. The office smelled like too many meetings and the lemon disinfectant of corporate color palettes. Martin looked older. The hair dye couldn't hold back the flecks of gray, and his suit was rumpled in a way that said he'd been in more fights this month than he had in the last 5 years combined. Blake sat across from him with that same smile that had cost me so many nights. He looked tired in a way that wasn't imposter syndrome, but the hollow exhaustion of someone carrying other people's choices. "Ethan," Martin began, and for a second he looked like a man who might have remembered the boy I'd been when I'd first interviewed, the one who had stayed late and cleaned the vending machine on a Friday because someone had to. But that man had been traded for a ledger. Martin's voice wavered when he spoke, the sort of voice that sells remorse in town hall meetings. "We made mistakes. We need someone too?" He stopped because the words didn't line up with the scale of what he'd allowed. The rash decisions, the empty promises to shareholders, the cuts that had taken out muscle and left bone. "We need someone to steady the ship," Blake said, trying to help as if he'd read the line from a manual. Part of me wanted to stand up and say, "You don't get to ask the man you pushed down to climb back on the ladder you stripped him of," but the part of me that had learned to let force be quiet held back. I sat and listened because there was power in the particular way I didn't leap. Martin explained the losses, legal fees, client churn, a drop in public confidence that had investors on edge. He used the kind of industry jargon that sounds like competence. Restructuring, realigning core competencies. What he did not use were the words "sorry" in a way that meant anything beyond a PR draft. He tried on apology like a suit that had been tailored to someone else's measurements. When he finally looked at me, you could see the pleading in his eyes stripped of the old condescension. The man who had called me stuck in front of everyone 3 years ago was asking me into his office like a drowning man, offering the rope he himself used to sink a colleague. "We'd like you to consult," he said. "We could pay you well. You know this business inside and out. Help us stabilize the platform, advise our leadership on project triage." That word, advise, landed like a small, obscene joke. Blake leaned forward as if he were about to accept a medal on Martin's behalf. The convenient humiliation I'd once felt was back in the room with us, but this time it twitched. It was nervous now. There was an instinct that had developed inside me through years of being invisible that wanted to make an entrance grand and catastrophic, to fling all the things I'd been forced to swallow in their faces and not stop talking until the microphones gave up. But I had learned something important in the warehouse with Marcus and Denise and the interns. Revenge that seeks to wound quickly often leaves the seeker raw and empty. The kind of justice I wanted was structural, slow, undeniable. So I said nothing for a long moment, the kind of long that makes men uncomfortable because it refuses to be filled. "You want me to fix your ship," I said at last, and my voice was steady. "Why?" Martin reached for the script he had practiced with counsel. "Because we value your institutional knowledge, Ethan." He said my name in the way you say a brand name you're trying to revive. I had not planned to let him say my name. I'd promised Laura I would not allow him that courtesy, but the sound of it made him human in a way that had been denied me when he used it as a weapon. "No," I said. It felt small and absolute, like a match struck and then dropped. Martin's face crumpled, the way bad men do when presented with the unexpected. Not enlightened, not even humbled, but unnerved. He tried again, like someone repeating a password. "We can make you a partner in the recovery effort, compensation, equity." The numbers were generous enough that a man counting only bank balance could be seduced. But we'd built a company that was compensated in other currencies. Autonomy, respect, the right to decide who we hired. "No," I said again. And this time Marcus's hand on my knee under the table gave me something like permission to walk away. Blake's face, which had once been a mask of entitlement, twitched into something like panic. "You don't understand what this would mean for us," he said, the indignation of someone interrupted mid-hijack. "You could make a lot of money," Martin offered, as if money were the lever that had taught them leadership. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the man who had once been my arbiter of worth, and then at the thin, trembling network of suits that had been built on his choices. "I made my own way," I said. "You taught me how not to be you." There was no theatrical flourish, only the quiet logic of a man who had spent years laying brick after brick for something that would not collapse under his weight. I left the office with their contempt like a coat, with Laura waiting in the car and the kids asleep in the back because it was late and we'd given them a bedtime, even when the world wanted a different one. For a while there was a sickness in the press, a ripple of interest that came when a once big firm falters, interviews from talking heads who love to cradle the image of a company dooming itself with arrogance. I waited for the call that would want me to step back in and save them. The call never felt like a request so much as a petition from a man who had burned the bridges that kept things honest. Instead, I got another kind of call, former colleagues calling to say they'd left because they couldn't stomach the new order, clients asking for help, small businesses around the state reaching out to say our product had kept them afloat when larger firms had failed them. Reputation, it turned out, travels in the opposite direction of hubris. Quiet competence draws toward it a gravity no amount of spin can buy. Martin's empire didn't fall in a day. Buildings don't collapse like in cheap thrillers. It sagged hinge by hinge, a toxic product review here, and SEC inquiry there for misreported metrics, a scandal whispered in legal filings that made board members ask the kind of questions that reveal true fragility. Blake tried to hold the line. He hired consultants and made speeches about new direction and cultural refresh, but people sense when a ship is leaking and they don't trust the captain who keeps rearranging deck chairs. The company bled clients, and when clients left, they took more than revenue. They took the mutual trust that had once been the company's best asset. One by one, the empty suits who loved the appearance of motion left, and the work fell to those who'd never stopped doing it. The few who remained in the bowels of the company's infrastructure, trying to patch what had been deliberately cut down. That's the cruelty of corporate short-termism. It rewards the flashy and starves the survivors. When the board finally called an emergency meeting to discuss sell-off options, Martin's voice trembled in a way his public vanity had never allowed before. Men who'd laughed at my quietness now called me as a last resort, because panic remembers competence. He called me from a number I didn't recognize because his secretary had gone home early, and the voice on the line was small and raw. "I've made mistakes," he said. "We need help. Please come in." There was a pleading there that wasn't rhetorical. He sounded like a man who had learned too late the cost of cheap applause. I could have laughed. I could have put the phone on speaker and played him the voicemail of him saying, "You're stuck," from years ago. Instead, I asked him to come to our office so I could see the man who'd made those choices in person. He arrived with Blake, who looked ashen and thinner than before. The company that had once been a cathedral had become a fast food franchise of decisions, cheap, assembled quickly, and not meant to last. Martin's shoulders carried the weight of investors' anger and his own private humiliation. He seemed to shrink in the warehouse light instead of fill it. He kept clearing his throat like a man trying to summon a speech he had not earned. "We need you," he said, and for the first time in our shared history I heard honesty and the admission of need rather than false flattery. Blake's gaze darted around the room like a trapped animal. "You can be handsomely compensated," Blake said, because his instincts were still to barter in the currency he knew best. Denise came out of her office to see who had arrived because we were small enough that strangers were noteworthy. Marcus stood at the doorway with a careful neutrality on his face. Lara brought coffee for Martin, even though she had little patience for his brand of apology. She wanted to see what dignity a man had after losing everything he had taken for granted. Martin looked at me then, and for a second I perceived a childlike hope that perhaps I would fix what he'd broken, that my hands could unmake the damage he'd done. That hope was the thing that made his ruin visible, not because I wanted him ruined, but because his ruin had always been self-fashioned by his choices. I listened to the pitch, consulting agreement, 3-month turnaround, fee structure, equity considerations. The words had numbers in them that would make an accountant giddy, but money was no longer the lens everybody else used. I thought of the interns, the woman who'd become CFO at 29 because she was brilliant and underpaid at her old firm. I thought of the mayor who'd written me a letter thanking us for saving their emergency communications. I thought of Marcus, who'd once fixed a server with a shoelace and a prayer. I thought of Denise, who taught me to look at spreadsheets the way surgeons look at x-rays. These were people who deserved leaders who would stay when things got dull and difficult, who would see the daily labor as the point rather than the theater of it. I thought of my daughter, who now sleeps through the night and knows her father not as a ghost in overalls of work, but as a man with a presence she trusts. And then I remembered Martin's face the day he promoted Blake, the warmth of his hand that felt like a shove. "Why should I help you?" I asked. The answer he offered was the same one he'd always offered. "Because I was a leader, and you were a valuable part of the team." I looked at Blake then and saw not the man who had earned a promotion, but the man who had in the wave of someone else's labor. "Because you can't do this without me," he continued, and the appeal was naked. I had the script that would have dazzled a room looking for spectacle. I could have quoted case studies, offered a consultant's retainer, accepted the money and the power to say who should stay and who should go. I could have taken on a job that would make headlines and make people say Ethan saved the day. But I had learned that headline rescues are for men who like to pretend that one speech will clean the rot from their houses. Clean houses are built over time with steady standards, and I had no interest in using my credibility to mend the paper-thin integrity Martin had shredded. "You taught me how to leave," I said quietly, and the sentence landed in the room like a verdict because it was true in 1,000 small ways. In the silence that followed, Martin tried to redefine what he'd meant by leadership, to lay it out as if he'd always valued stewardship and not spectacle. I listened as he dressed his old habits in new words, as Blake tried to make a co-conspiratorial expression, as if they'd finally realized that actors need directors, and directors need actors. My refusal was not a speech but a line. No, it was a refusal that didn't require theatrics because it was informed by all the small decencies I'd learned on the way up. Never take a job that asks you to trade your principles for applause. Never patch a moral wound with a check. Martin's face folded inward like paper, the way someone looks down at their own handwriting and discovers a line they can't trace back to a hand that cared. He blamed the board, the market, the consultants. The list of external culprits became a litany of the kind of language that excused him from responsibility. Blake tried to make it personal in the way convenience demands personalization. You don't understand our position. What I did understand, I had seen their position from the inside, watched decisions made for the sake of optics, felt the steady shrink of quality as budgets were cut. "We can pay you more than you've ever made," Martin said finally, as if dollars somehow repaid years. I looked at my team then, at Marcus hardened by nights without sleep, at Denise who measured risk like a second sight, at the interns who had learned to take pride in fixing a bug and not in the applause of a distant investor. My refusal wasn't petty. It was strategic. "No," I said, and there was a smile on my face. Not the smile I had when I'd been flattered in conference rooms, but the exact cold smile Martin had used on me years before, the one that acknowledged someone as a placeholder and then discarded them. It was the same smile because I knew its power, and I wanted him to feel a reflection of what he'd inflicted. He flinched as if struck, and in that flinch was the ruin I'd watched come to pass. A man who had cultivated cheap performances now facing the consequences of no longer having the competence he had sold. "Please," Martin said, and it was the sound of a man whose applause had dried up and whose hands had been empty for too long. Blake looked away, and for the first time I saw regret in him that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with survival. I stood up then and walked out of the warehouse past the people who had built a life with me, past the sweating machines and the whiteboards covered in the messy handwriting of real work, and I left them with their decisions and their consequences. I did not gloat. I did not savor his ruin the way a gladiator savors a kill. What I felt was something quieter and more final, the knowledge that justice often looks like steadiness, not spectacle, that the man who begged me to return would have to live with his choices. He would have to learn to rebuild competence in the quiet hours, to hire people who would not be swayed by shiny slides. As I drove home with the sunset bleeding orange across the freeway, with Laura beside me and the kids asleep at home, where bedtime was a ceremony we kept, I felt a relief that tasted like clean air. Weeks later, when Martin's company filed for a restructuring that looked more like an obituary than a path forward, the news anchors thanked experts who had predicted the fall. They used phrases like classic mismanagement and fiscal hubris, and offered sound bites from people who loved the drama of ruin. But inside the story, in the tiny rooms where the remaining engineers swept up boxes and the receptionist closed the door for the last time, there were real losses. Careers uprooted, pensions dangling, towns that supplied workers suddenly confused about their future. When a man has built his life by elevating the appearance of movement over the reality of work, the collapse isn't a tidy lesson. It's a messy catastrophe for people who trusted the man more than his performance. I received another email from Sandra months later, not because Martin had regained anything, but because he had been forced to sow seeds of reconciliation where he'd practiced pruning people. It reads simply, "He asked me to reach out one last time." The tone said enough. I forwarded it to Laura and Marcus and Denise. We discussed it like we discussed clients, in terms of values and risks and the dignity of labor. We agreed that there was no moral imperative to rescue a man who had weaponized his position. There was only a practical question. Did helping now preserve something that mattered to people beyond Martin's fragile reputation? The answer was no. When Martin finally walked into our warehouse, it was not with a swagger, but with the rustle of someone who had been taught to take applause for accountability and had finally learned the cost. He looked at our operation, the way our interns joked, the way Marcus adjusted a rack with a calm hand, the way Denise ran numbers with an easy authority, and he realized that the thing he had wanted to buy back was not a person, but a culture he had eroded. He asked for a consultant's help again, not because he believed in me, but because his options had dwindled, and because the alternative was admitting he'd been wrong in a way that bankrupts ego and pocket alike. I listened while he stammered apologies that smelled of the same disinfectant as his office, and when he reached out his hands, I refused him with a single sentence, short, cold, and clipped to the bone, because it had to be, because the story needed not a sermon, but a final decisive sound. Don't ask the man you broke to fix your ruin.
Betrayal leaves scars, but sometimes it also leaves lessons. What lesson did this story leave with you? Share it in the comments, and let's see how many of us have walked through the same kind of fire. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one.